it's a slightly slower process because identification has to be checked.
Sorry. Prime Minister, just some final questions on the first lockdown decision. You referred earlier to the debate about herd immunity and also the advice that the government received to the effect that implementation of the measures, plural, should not be undertaken too early. A great deal of evidence has been received about the nature of the debate about herd immunity, the danger of suppression, which might lead to an uncoiled spring, and the issue of the timing of measures, which then led into the wider debate about behavioural fatigue. You'll recall all these debates. What should the inquiry make of those debates? To what extent did they occupy valuable time and bandwidth in the weeks of the 2nd and 9th of March? Do you recall there being a great deal of time spent on debating these somewhat conceptual issues?
You know, I don't precisely. I think I was probably a receiver, as it were, of information on that topic. The Department for Health were the ones who were the lead department presenting the information. The delay contain strategy was one that, to best of my knowledge, had been signed off by our scientific health advisors. That's what we were told, I think, at Cabinet. So I had no reason to particularly doubt it.
That was a document that was published on the 3rd of March. It had its genesis in a commissioning email from the Secretary of State on the 10th of February. I'm more concerned with the weeks leading up to those
you mean after
the decision to implement the measures of the 12th, 16th, and then the 20th of March.
I don't think the overall strategy changed. I think it always was the strategy, which was to not completely suppress the curve, but to flatten the peak and push it out. I do remember that this concept, I don't have any strong recollections, but I remember the Chief Science Advisor talking about herd immunity in that context. And I think the minutes of one of the meetings I think maybe it is on the 12th, to your point, where I think the minutes say that he said a good outcome being that by September 2020 herd immunity would be reached. So that's in the
reference to herd immunity. In fact,
that's in the minutes of that meeting attributed to him. But I think it was just to get to the point across that the aim and the goal could not be and should not be to completely suppress the virus. It was about changing the shape of the curve. And all these interventions I saw as our previous conversation at the end of the last session were about doing that so that the NHS was not overwhelmed.
There were a number of SAGE meetings and COBRA meetings where the issue of don't go too early, timing is vital, dominated the debate, at least the debate about whether or not measures should be implemented. You were, of course, present at the COBRAs. To what extent do you assess that had the government not received advice, don't go too early, there is a limit to which the population will be able to countenance and to deal with such measures? To what extent did that debate slow down the ultimate decision-making?
Okay, my strong recollection from this period is that the government acted, I think, almost immediately on the recommendations from SAGE.
But SAGE didn't, with respect to make specific suggestions. It could only recommend that more stringent interventions would be applied, and then they would produce papers showing what the consequences would be of any particular intervention.
But they also advised on timing.
They did, ultimately on the 30th.
Both on substance and timing. So I think on the 9th of March, from memory, I have to check, was the meeting where they said, look, here are 3 things that we think you're going to need to do, but we don't think you need to implement even the first one until later in the month. And here are 3 things that you definitely don't need to think about now, including banning mass events or closing schools. So that was a meeting I remember vividly. Now, that was on the 9th, I think.
That was the week of the 9th of March.
And then what happened on what then they came back with timing advice, which on the 12th was more specific, and the timing advice on the 12th said you don't need to implement the first of these until I think the 20th, and the other two later. Then that all changed on the 16th.
Well, there was a 13th stage where they said don't allow a concern about the timing of implementation to delay anything you might wish to do. So there was a change on the 13th in terms of material from Sage, and the evidence is quite clearly that there were dramatic changes in the approach over that weekend.
I think the 16th is the meeting that I remember, which is where, and I think the imperial modelling had come out at around the same time. Sage themselves said at that moment in time, and it's recorded in the minutes, that their view had changed just in the past few days. So
That's what you recall.
Yes, in those mid-teens days, something changed. I do remember it was the imperial modelling that had come out at around the same time, which no doubt was a factor, but again, you'd have to ask them. And then on the 16th, that's when they said, we need to do these things sooner than we thought, do them now. And I think the Prime Minister announced them that day.
He did. There was a suite of measures on the 16th, and then, of course, decision taken on the 18th to close schools, and then on the 20th, you'll recall vividly the decision that non-essential retail and so on should shut. But the fact that you, as Chancellor, recall the debate about the warning, and I don't mean that in any pejorative sense, the debate about the potential impact of going too early, rather suggests that it was an important issue and that it would be prone, it would be likely to have had an impact on the decision-making process.
I think we were following the advice from the scientists. So I do agree that we were influenced and informed by what they were telling the government to do and when to do it. And they definitely earlier on, as you've mentioned, they talked a lot about timing and not going too early, in their words, in the press conferences and with us in meetings.
On Thursday, the 19th of March, WhatsApps between Mr. Cummings and Mr. Keynes show that there was an emergency, or at least a debate, that had to take place in front of the Prime Minister concerning the fear that the bond market, or I suppose the gilts market, as we would call it, might collapse, or at least a concern as to the extent to which the government might be able to fund itself. Just so that we can get the chronological picture correct, did you go and debate or speak to the Prime Minister on that Thursday in relation to your concerns about funding, because there had been, or as there was shortly to be, a placing of debt in the marketplace that failed? So there was a real problem on that Thursday.
Yes. Now, I don't recall the precise timing and the date by when I was speaking to the Prime Minister on these issues, but you'll have a record of it. But the key moments were I received advice on the 19th.
Thursday.
Yes, and the reason for that was the day before there was a very significant move in gilt rates. So the cost of our borrowing, to put it in ordinary language, and there had been a move across most developed markets, bond markets, but the move in the UK was outsized relative to our peers, and that was obviously concerning. So that was the global investment community starting to take a different view on the UK government's ability to borrow, or the price that we should pay for that. And the cost of our borrowing at that point had tripled in a matter of probably about a week.
So it was a very major problem.
So that was, and there are some other things that are technical, but led the Treasury and the advice I was getting to tell me that there was the gilt markets were showing some signs of impaired functioning. So that was that was what was happening on the 18th and the 19th.
Indeed.
And then something else happened on the 21st.
I don't want to go into the detail of it, but would you just confirm that, of course, the government put arrangements into place to ensure additional liquidity in the event they weren't used, but the government was on top of the problem, and you raised this problem with the Prime Minister on the Thursday in the context of the decision-making which was then going on as to whether or not London should be locked down first. And you were concerned that in any final decision, the Prime Minister understood that the bond market, the gilt market, was a consideration.
Yes.
Is that fair?
So I think it's worth, if you don't mind me just spending a minute on it, because I do think it's important for the context of the time, because it was incredibly worrying to me as Chancellor. What happened on the 21st is that we had a failed gilt auction.
Is
Now,
this
what
the
does that mean?
DMO operation?
Yes. What that means is the government, in order to fund itself and pay for all the things that we need, borrows in the markets. And on that day, when we tried to borrow from people, the auction didn't go as planned, and we couldn't raise the money we needed. That is a extremely serious and rare event. It had happened once before in the financial crisis, and it unsurprisingly caused enormous anxiety inside the Treasury and with me, because it was a very worrying development. Subsequent to that, the government had to enter into, I think, what you were referring to, Mr. Keith, which was something called the Ways and Means Facility, which, again, in ordinary parlance is an overdraft facility at the Bank of England. It's the government saying we're not sure if we're going to be able to borrow the money that we need and fund ourselves, so we will open up essentially an overdraft at the Bank of England, and if need be, they will just fund us, which is, again, almost unprecedented. It happened once before in the crisis, and it's strong evidence of the extreme stress that we were under from a financing perspective. Sorry to explain, but I think it's important for understanding the context that I was operating in, and that's what I would have, over the course of those few days, no doubt have explained to the Prime Minister.
And what did you understand to have been the impact of you telling the Prime Minister about your concerns? So in the context of the debate which was running on, of course, during those days as to the extent to which further measures would need to be imposed, and, of course, ultimately whether there should be a lockdown decision, what impact did your concerns about the gilt or the bond market and the government's ability to fund itself have on that decision-making process? And I ask, and so that you are clear, there is some suggestion that there was on that Thursday mooted the possibility of locking down London in advance of the rest of the country. And we want to know to what extent that decision was influenced by the concerns about government borrowing.
I think probably a question for the previous Prime Minister, really, because he would have been hearing lots of different things from lots of different...
But you must have expressed a view on it to the Prime Minister when you spoke to him on the Thursday.
I don't recall, other than explaining to him the stress that we were under, and it was a relevant consideration for him. That's why he had an impossible job in many ways to balance all these very difficult things. But with regard to London specifically, I recollect that meeting, and I recollect that the priority intervention that had been recommended, suggested by Sage, was to close schools. And we did that. The Prime Minister announced that, I think, on the same day as the meeting, on the 18th, not just in London, but nationally.
Yes.
So in terms of the substantive, here are these set of options for London, the one in the papers that it says would be most effective was closing schools. That was announced the same day by the Prime Minister, acted on.
What debate did you have with the Prime Minister about whether or not locking London was an advisable step to take in light of your concerns about the gilt market?
I don't recall a specific meeting or conversation about those two things. I think more generally, as I've said, my job was to provide him with best economic evidence, advice, analysis, and it was a relevant consideration for him that there was this situation in the gilt markets. It was right that he was aware of that. And of course, with regard to London, we took the advice of Sage and closed schools, not just in London, but across the entire country on the same day that that advice came to the committee.
Yes, the decision was then announced on the 18th to take effect from the 20th.
On the 20th, that's right.
In your statement, so that we can understand, and it's a matter of obviously huge public interest, we can understand the nature of the impact of the lockdown decision. Have you set out, and we'll have your statement at page 53, at paragraphs 182 to 187, the scale of the economic and social impact of the pandemic restrictions? Mr. Sunak, I'm going to respectfully ask you to try to keep your answers as concise as you can. Perhaps you might just agree with the following proposition. Do you set out in those paragraphs the damage that was done in terms of the impact on GDP, the damage on the economy, the government's borrowing, the costs, of course, the fiscal impact, and the scarring, that is to say, the long-term damage that was done to the economy through alterations in labour supply and the like? So you've attempted to set out in very broad terms what the lockdown decision did.
Yes, my witness statement contains a summary of the various economic impacts. As you highlighted, biggest fall in GDP was predicted in hundreds of years, borrowing reaching World War II levels, the impact that that would have obviously on the labour market, unemployment, and tax levels, which obviously we're grappling with today. Economic scarring is the long-term impact on the economy from things that happen in the short term. Again, I won't go over it in great detail, but I think it's clear that as a result of what was happening, that the economy was being impacted, jobs would be impacted, which is crucial for people's livelihoods, businesses would be impaired, and because of the borrowing that was necessary, that would have an impact on future tax levels. In summary, those are a high level. I'm happy to elaborate if you need, but they're contained in my witness statement.
So just to reassure you and others, I don't just take into account your oral evidence, but I do, before reaching any conclusions, take into account everything you've said in writing. So don't worry, it'll all be considered.
And to be plain, I've asked you because it's important that the public understand that you have attempted to set out in your witness statement some of the overarching consequences of the major first lockdown decision.
If I might, Mr. Keith, people can see it. I think it's important, and this is always tricky in public policy, is many of these impacts are not felt immediately. They're felt over time. And that is always a tough thing to deal with when you're communicating. But as it turned out, we were able to borrow what we needed to fund the pandemic response. The impact of having to pay it back only comes well after the fact, when everyone everyone forgets why it was necessary, and now everyone is grappling with the consequences. I am grappling with the consequences of that as we have a historically high, a tax burden that is higher than I would like. That is a direct consequence of the support that was provided during the pandemic and then later on. But as I said, those things are often hard to get across, but they're all contained in the statement.
Let's please not go into the issue of tax burdens. There are two issues to which you pay particular attention in your statement following the lockdown in March and April 2020, Mr. Sunak. The first is the HMT expressed concern that there'd been over-compliance with the government's stay-at-home messaging during the first lockdown. Essentially, you were concerned, and your department was concerned, that the public hadn't understood sufficiently clearly from the government's communications that they should go to work only if they could not work from home, and that the messaging perhaps had the nuance of that position had been lost in the overall messaging, stay at home to help us save lives. What did the Exchequer do about that? Was there any means open to you to try to change the messaging or to try to ensure that people did go to work where they permissibly and legally could do so?
You're right in summarising the situation. Perhaps the best example of it is in the construction industry, which, because it was by its nature outdoors and we'd seen what had happened in other European countries, more activity was able to be continued in Europe than was the case in the UK. So that was a good example of the messaging being slightly lost. I don't think there was anything that we could do about it, particularly. It was a relevant point when we came to the exit roadmap in the May plan and trying to get that messaging right. And because the scientific advice and the modelling was predicated on an amount of people who were working from home and amount of people who were at work, and what ended up happening is those assumptions were essentially undershot and fewer people were out at work than had been anticipated.
Indeed. Could I ask you, please, also just to slow down a little bit when you give your answers, Prime Minister? There's a record, of course, being kept by our stenographer. If we could just look at 236583, it's an email from, again, your Principal Private Secretary in the Treasury to various recipients. And as you rightly say, this is in fact dated April, but it's on the cusp of the debate about the recovery plan. So, as you say, the debate about coming out of the lockdown. The email, it says, the Chancellor is considering the paper for the Cabinet Office process. Quick readout of the discussion in the meeting this afternoon, and then obviously references to your position in relation to the various issues which are being debated within the Treasury. How difficult it is to argue that the MPI should be lifted while the number of cases and deaths is still rising. but that you are broadly supportive of the strategy that encourages return behaviour back to the economy. Then there's a reference to economic groups starting to model, and your wish that you have very clearly in mind the exact timetable of what advice on modelling has been given, and then a reference to the timing of any decision. If you could go forward, please, to page 4, we will see this specifically following up on NPI Commission, Non-Pharmaceutical Intervention Commission. I know you're already working on a paper updating the Chancellor on the economic impact of NPIs. There's going to be a wider cabinet discussion. And then this at 3B, Prime Minister. I propose the following as a next step: a paper that we can share with the Prime Minister ahead of the bilateral, an opportunity for the Chancellor to set out his views and the economic analysis to the Prime Minister without it being watered down by the Cabinet Office process. Do you know what that is a reference to, the watered down by the Cabinet Office process? Because plainly, you as the Chancellor are absolutely entitled, you suggested it yourself, perhaps constitutionally obligated to bring the economic angle to bear in front of the Prime Minister without it being watered down by any other part of government. So what is that a reference to, do you think?
Obviously, I didn't write the email, so it's hard for me to comment. And if you flick back to the earlier bit of the email, I think, actually, as you can see from that, it clearly mentions a Cabinet Office process.
Yes.
Which is right and appropriate, but also, even when it talks about modelling on sectors, to bring that together with CMO thinking on the health impacts.
But
I think
very...
even in that email, you can see, as I said, I didn't write it, so I'm not sure entirely what it's referring to, but it's clear that there is a Cabinet Office process that we are feeding into, CMOs feeding in, and that's the right way for the Prime Minister to receive.
There is no suggestion but that there shouldn't be a process. There has to be a process. The Cabinet Office will synthesise to some extent what is contributed by other government departments. But these are the most senior officials in your department talking about your position and your thoughts and what should be done in advance of a bilateral. And it refers to a concern that your voice might be watered down by the Cabinet Office. And therefore, that must have been something of which you were aware, if only in the most general terms.
I think, as I said previously, I never felt that I didn't have an opportunity to feed in what I wanted to the Prime Minister. And again, I didn't write the email. I'm not sure how officials may have felt in their conversations with other departments or the Cabinet Office. I generally thought we had good, constructive relations. And for my part, I felt I always had the opportunity to feed into the Prime Minister's thinking.
All right. A second noteworthy debate was taking place before we look at the detail of the roadmap. You expressed concern in May, in fact at a 9:15 meeting on the 14th of May, that international polling had suggested that the British people were more fearful of the virus than other countries. And in the Spectator article, to which I've already referred you, you state that when you say this, it's quoted, "In every brief, we tried to say, let's stop the fear narrative. It was always wrong from the beginning. I constantly said it was wrong." What was that about? What was your concern about the general response of the British people?
Again, from an economic perspective, we are a consumption-driven economy, and therefore people's jobs and livelihoods and our ability to pay for public service is a function of consumption being strong. And if you have a situation like this where we've actively discouraged or shut down consumption sectors from operating, once they reopen, it was a point of concern for me and for anyone thinking about the economy and those jobs as to the pace of return, of people returning to normal activity over time. Because if they didn't, then that would have significant implications for many people's jobs. And those sectors of the economy, and this is a really important point, that were most impacted by lockdown, these consumption sectors, hospitality, leisure, tourism, retail, disproportionately employed people who were the most vulnerable in society. Those on the lowest incomes, people coming off welfare, women, ethnic minorities, those working part-time. So those jobs, I think, as a matter of social justice, were particularly important to try and safeguard. And polling was clear. I can't remember the exact polling firm, but there was international polling,
Ipsos,
that demonstrated there seemed to be, well, there was a much greater reticence for people in the UK to want to return back to all those activities, even once things had been reopened, and that would have genuine impacts on people's lives and their jobs, and and everything else that we'd want to do as a country. So that was their concern.
The clock is ticking. I'm going to ask you to try to just be a little bit more concise, if you wouldn't mind, Prime Minister. On the subject of the obvious understanding of the needs of those in part-time work, the vulnerable, the young, female employees, members of the black and minority ethnic sector, your statement makes it plain that if not at the forefront, certainly a major part of the Exchequer's thinking throughout the pandemic was the need to ensure that their interests were not forgotten, and that as much should be done as possible and ought to be done as possible in terms of trying to get the consumer sector back to life, to safeguard their position. And we'll just have a quick look where you've summarised the position. It's your statement 232069, and the interventions are at page 26. Sorry, it's not 232069, it's your witness statement, page 26. In briefings and papers that were circulated before meetings, there was often reference to and consideration of the equalities impact. You received equality impact assessments in relation to HMT policies. And then if we scroll back out, paragraph 82, you were obviously aware from an early stage that less well-off households were particularly vulnerable to the economic shock. How could you not, of course, be aware? And consideration was therefore purposefully given to at-risk and other vulnerable groups in your economic decision-making. So that's clear. I think in paragraph 83, you also refer to long COVID. Do you recall at what time long COVID presented itself on the Exchequer's horizon?
I don't specifically. I recall in the May plan having a conversation with the CMO about including in that document consideration of other health impacts beyond the immediate COVID impacts. And I think there's some language in the May plan that talks about the various other health impacts at that point. It's something I was keen to stress that was a consequence of all of this that we should understand. I don't remember specifically.
All right. And on account of, as you rightly say, the need to ensure that the retail and hospitality sectors could be brought back to life as soon as reasonably possible, the Treasury pushed, indeed, for the sector to be opened ahead of schools. That was the original position of HMT, was it not?
I think if I recall,
it wasn't ultimately what happened, but I think that was the Exchequer's position.
If I recall it correctly, when I was having these deliberations or participating in them in May, there's a letter I sent to the Prime Minister that contains it. Non-essential retail, I think you'll have the exhibit that may be helpful. I talk about non-essential retail because of the economic, the jobs. There are millions of jobs, and particularly the type of people in those jobs. But also, as we later discovered, and was my sense during, Sage themselves later said that non-essential retail had a very minimal impact on R. That was what all the evidence concluded, that it was very minimal impact on R. And now, with regard to schools, I've said in that May thing, they should be opened, particularly the early years, alongside or immediately after non-essential retail and before hospitality, because I care very much about the impact on children and their educational attainment and development, and that letter talks about those things. So retail because of the jobs and because it had minimal impact. Immediately alongside that, particularly the early years, education of schools and nurseries, and it was only after that hospitality. So that was the sequencing in the letter I wrote in May.
If we have 236585, it's an email from your principal private secretary to various recipients. And on the first page, there is a reference to the Chancellor focusing in, perhaps it's on page 2. Yes, the second bullet point. Therefore, need hospitality open in the summer, July, and to, here's this, and to stage things, this means open sectors now, schools early June, and non-essential between the two in mid-May. So suddenly at the beginning of May, and this is dated, I think, the 4th of May, the proposal from the Treasury is we've got to get hospitality and particularly non-essential open, and then schools will follow. And there's another letter, an email, 232085, paragraph 17 on page 2. This is your letter delivering our roadmap dated May. Paragraph 17. We must then continue with our plan to return early years reception in years 1 and 6 to school. That is continuing after the opening of non-essential retail. Can you recall why how the final position was reached, the order of play in which schools and non-essential retail opened? Do you recall how that debate was resolved?
No, not particularly. I think you said previously, Ms. Keith, that hospitality was before schools, which is, as you said there, it's not. It was retail and education pretty much together, one after another, and hospitality later.
That was the position that was reached, yes.
But that was also what that email said.
Right.
The one that you had previously popped up also had hospitality in July and schools and retail before then.
You called in according to the email from your principal private secretary dated the 4th of May, she says open sectors now, then schools early June and non-essential between the two. So open sectors now, then non-essential, then schools. But
I said hospitality thereafter. It says hospitality. I don't have it in front of me, but it had hospitality.
Let's have a look.
July.
236585.
On my reading of it, if you look at the months, I don't think between the two makes sense.
Well,
I mean, I think it's if you have the second page up.
Yes, it's the second page.
I think it said need hospitality open in summer brackets July.
This means open sectors now, schools early June, and non-essential between the two mid-May. So non-essential is coming in before schools.
Yes, just a couple of weeks. But I think what you'd said that hospitality was also coming in. I just want to reiterate that was never the case.
Between the two doesn't make sense. Yeah. It's first.
It was retail and schools.
This was your policy, Prime Minister.
All I'd say is that the point was to do retail and schools a couple of weeks apart in May, June. Hospitality was always summer because it was the last thing. Retail because, as you see from the letter that you had up in May, the jobs and the people particularly employed in those jobs, again, people who are more vulnerable work in retail on lower incomes, and actually those jobs therefore have I think a broader social purpose or benefit as well as the job itself. And in schools, as far as I remember it, again, not obviously my particular responsibility, there was actually a real concern that it would be very difficult to get schools to come back. And I would imagine you've taken evidence on that point. But my recollection was that there was quite a lot of resistance from the sector about schools coming back. I think there was parents were also concerned, and there was an issue that many school teachers were themselves either isolating or impacted, and actually it would be very difficult to have schools open in full.
All right, so all that was part of the mix.
That was part of the mix.
I've suggested to you that this wasn't exactly how it panned out, but it was quite clear that consideration was given to these various competing factors and reasons why schools could only be open when they were.
Again, a question probably for the Education Secretary and the Prime Minister. I'd say from an economic perspective, or the only input the Treasury would have into that deliberation or the Cabinet Office would be the labour market impact. And that's why, from a purely economic perspective, again, it would be the Education Secretary who would talk about children's attainment, although I cared very much about that, as you can see from the letter I sent, and it's there because I long stand had concerns about that. But from an analytical perspective, what the Treasury could do is explain, I mean, unsurprisingly, if you open early years and children and primary school children, that it has a disproportionate benefit on the labour market because it means their parents can return to work in a way that doesn't. You don't necessarily get that benefit from older students. But
all right. Around the same time, in fact, on the 7th of May, you expressed to a COVID-S, Mr. Sunak, your concern that unless the economy was reopened at perhaps a somewhat faster speed than some other cabinet ministers were advising, we would be at risk of placing the United Kingdom at a competitive disadvantage. And you referred to international comparative data, in essence, how other European countries were showing, you said, how reopening the economy can be done. Can we just look very briefly at the issue of comparative data? Did the Treasury, throughout the whole crisis, refer repeatedly, of course, to what other countries were doing, what their data was demonstrating, what ultimate decisions they were taking in light of their own particular positions? And was that something that was at the forefront of the debate when these arguments came to be ventilated in front of the Prime Minister?
I think it's probably too much to say it was at the forefront, but certainly right to say it was another piece of information that was helpful and worth taking into account. Yes.
All right. On the 28th of April, so again around this time, you had a bilateral with the Prime Minister, 236-584. Again, this is a note from your Principal Private Secretary referring to a bilateral on Tuesday. The subject matter is PM bilateral on Tuesday. On the first page, there is a reference to the Prime Minister's instinct, we can see there in the first bullet point, being that we might have overdone lockdown, telling that no other countries closed construction, turned to our international slide, but said interesting that there are new opportunities coming out of this and online is growing. And he also says a little later down the page, a little further down the page, that the sooner gets this open, the better, but then refers to the risk of another exponential increase. And I think he says, overall, he's agitated that he didn't have a plan. Yes. To what extent in these early days of the roadmap, Mr. Sunak, what was the Prime Minister concerned as to how he would equate the imperative of making sure that there be no unnecessary risk in growth in prevalence and the need to get the economy back going? It must have been a source of perpetual anxiety, and you had these debates with him as to how he should resolve them.
Again, probably better addressed to him, but we recapped previously the economic impacts. By this point, we had a much greater sense of what they were because we were, I don't see the date of this email, but I think, did you say May or end of April?
Yes, it's the end of April, 28th of April.
The government's independent forecaster, the OBR, had published their reference scenario, I think perhaps a week, 10 days before this, so that would be in the public domain. It was pretty stark. I won't recap it all again, but that was then out there, and we were collecting real-time data on the number of people who were furloughed, the businesses that were shut, et cetera, et cetera. So it would be unsurprising if that wasn't something that he was considering.
There is an email from, again, the same Elizabeth Perelman on the 21st of May, 232-168. This is an email which follows yet another meeting with the Prime Minister, in which she says, I think probably on page 2, no one can say that HMT has not given gold standard economic advice to the Prime Minister, Chancellor. But perhaps there might be an element of marking one's own homework there. But the Chancellor has not eloquently and authentically put these points across. So there could be no question but that you've eloquently and authentically put these points across. But once again, he was a lone voice, and it was a tricky meeting where sense was they were trying to appease him. Do you recall what that is a reference to?
No.
Was it, do you think, a reference to the fact that in this particular meeting, you had argued for an opening up of the economy, but the majority of the room had expressed its combined view that the risk of opening up too fast would have terrible consequences further down the road? What, was that not the debate that was going on at the time?
I can't comment on the particular meeting because I don't recall it. In general, I was making the points at this time about the economic impact, what was happening internationally, the fact that we were investing in test and trace and the Joint Biosecurity Centre as new institutions that would allow us to manage an exit. And I was also concerned at this point in time about the data that we were receiving on transmission and admissions. And I think it was exactly around this time that it was clear that we had probably been overestimating R. That's something that SAGE themselves acknowledged a bit later. And also the issue of nosocomial transmission, where a large amount of the transmission that was happening not in sectors of the economy that were open or closed, but in hospitals or care homes, which requires a slightly obviously different response. Those weren't well understood issues earlier on, but it was clear that they were starting to become issues. So those were the types of conversations that I was having at that moment in time.
Do you recall in June how an HMT official who attended SAGE provided a readout which referred to the fact that the CMO, Professor Sir Chris Whitty, and the government's chief scientific advisor, Professor Sir Patrick Vallance, began to warn that the package of measures for reopening, in particular the beginning of July, was at the riskier end of the spectrum and therefore had the potential to increase R above 1. Do you recall that warning being relayed to you or to the Treasury at the end of June?
You know, I don't. What I do recall, though, and perhaps should have started with this, is this May plan. I'd say two things about it. One, that it was conditional, so there were various tests that were set out to unlock each stage, and indeed it was delayed at one point, which shows, I think, the flexibility, decision-making and responsiveness to the health concerns.
Yes, step 2 was delayed from the 1st to the 15th of June.
Yes, that's right. But I think it demonstrates the process working and the conditions working. And the second, and perhaps most important thing to say is, you know, the May plan was developed with scientific and epidemiological input. And it was modelled at SAGE in early May. I remember the CMO, and again, this is recorded in the minutes of the COVID strategy meeting at the time, saying that this package of measures should not push R above 1. That was my strong
What date was that?
That was in the COVID strategy meeting, I think, I haven't got the exact date in front of me, in May. I'm happy to send it. It's in my witness statement.
By June, Mr. Sunak, wasn't the scientific evidence, the epidemiological evidence from SAGE and from the CMO and the GCSA, was that the measures which had been agreed, first proposed and then agreed, were at the riskier end of the spectrum? And I'm specifically asking you about the stage which had been reached by then, late June, which was step 3. Were you not aware that the scientists were beginning to question the speed at which the roadmap was operating? Do you recall that being brought to your attention?
No. I think they always thought that from the beginning. I think they thought it was consistent with R not being above 1, but I think from the beginning they thought it was, you know, at that end of the spectrum. It was closer to 1 than it was to 0.1, if I could put it that way. But they were involved and modelled the package of measures that was announced in May. I think that's important.
Well, no, they didn't model the package, Mr. Sunak. They gave advice through SAGE on what the consequences would be of the package. And then it was for the government, the Prime Minister in particular, to decide what consequences would flow from whatever he decided.
So that's, again, I don't have a perfect recollection, but I thought in May, either on the 2nd or 5th, around that time, that SAGE had modelled the impact on R of the various measures under consideration. And at the meeting, I think on the 6th, the CMO and CSA, the minutes record, were broadly content.
That was, I think, in relation to the broad roadmap, which was itself dated the 13th of May, and step 1, which of course was the first step. The second step, which was 15th of June, and the third step, of course, came later. And by the end of June, the 23rd of June, the CMO and the GCSA were warning that the package of measures was at the riskier end of the spectrum, with the potential to increase R above 1. Shall we have a look at 232181? It's a readout of SAGE from your Principal Private Secretary. Vallance noted the heavy trailing in the press of the measures the government has now announced it will relax. He and Whitty had made clear to the policymakers that this package was at the riskier end of the spectrum, with the potential to increase R above 1, and that they needed to be prepared to reimpose measures if necessary. Noted also this package reduces the space for doing other things like bringing schools back in September. If schools are to return, policymakers may have to reimpose restrictions in other places like retail. The government had obviously made the various decisions that it made in relation to the 3 steps in the roadmap. But by the end of June, the Treasury was, of course, considering the voucher scheme that became Eat Out to Help Out. Was that not something that was being contemplated at the end of June, with a view to its implementation in August?
Yes, I mean, I don't recall seeing that email, so that didn't come to me. As I said, the exit plan was developed and hadn't changed, and I strongly recall it being modelled in terms of the impact on R, and people broadly being comfortable that it did just about keep things at that level. And I think the other thing, as I said, that was relevant consideration at this time was that in June, probably actually 3 days before this email, the SAGE minutes record that there had been errors that meant that for some time they had been overestimating the rate of transmission, making it look artificially high.
Well, so there was an issue about hospital data, was there not?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the SAGE minutes from the 20th of June, it's very clear that SAGE, because there were errors in the data collection, so it meant that all the numbers we were working off were artificially high. There was also a separate conversation.
Forgive me, just so that we don't lose track of where we're going.
Yeah, but I think it's a relevant consideration.
If you just bear with me.
Of course.
In the same email, in the middle of the page, there's a bullet point which refers to that very issue. The NHS have looked into the serious concerns raised by the modellers about the hospital admissions data and claim it's causing no more than a 5% error in that data stream. So there was a debate about the significance of the error and what its impact was, but the NHS appeared to say there was no more than a 5% error. But be that as it may, whatever the position was on the data, the CMO and the GCSA were raising a general alarm at the end of June about the risk that the transmission prevalence would go up and that the package which had already been agreed was itself already at the riskier end of the spectrum. So the question for you is, to what extent did HMT understand at the end of June that whatever it proposed to do thereafter came with significant risk?
That's just not my recollection of it. I mean, my recollection was that we went over a set of things that could be done. It was conditional. It was delayed at one stage on the advice from the scientists. So I think that shows that the process was working. I think there were genuine issues about the robustness of the data, but also where the R was coming from, because there was this issue about nosocomial transmission that was definitely not properly understood at the time, potentially accounting for up to a quarter of the transmission, which obviously requires a very different response. But also, I think analysis has been done subsequent to this that I wasn't aware of at the time from, I think, professors of medicine and economics at Imperial and Manchester that applied a Quayle analysis to the first lockdown and its duration. And their Quayle analysis, which you'll be familiar with as a tool of health public health analysis, suggested that the lockdown in its severity and duration is likely to have generated costs that are greater than the likely benefit. Well, so I think I wasn't aware of that at the time.
I'm so
but
sorry. I don't want to get into quality life assurance models. Is it your position as the Chancellor, that at the end of June you were unaware that the government's chief advisors, epidemiological public health advisors, were making clear that the existing package was already at the riskier end of the spectrum, and therefore that going forward, real care would have to be taken to ensure that that prevalence and the R rate going above 1 did not eventuate.
I was always clear that schools was something they viewed as a big risk factor, which I think is alluded to in that email.
Did you know that the package in place was at the riskier end of the spectrum epidemiologically?
I don't precisely remember that, but I do remember it was modelled and designed to keep R at or below 1.
All right.
And as I said, I'm sure it was closer to 1 than it was to 0.1. But remember, as we've discussed in the first session, policymakers are taking into account a whole range of considerations, and the objective strategy here was not to completely suppress the virus. It was to make sure that the NHS was not overwhelmed. That is consistent with a range of R ratios.
The point is well made. Ultimately, the Prime Minister has to make the final decision, and he'll take into account the risk, he'll take into account the economic and fiscal consequences. But the point here is that this demonstrates that the Treasury, because this is your principal private secretary, were told, rightly and responsibly, that there were alarm bells ringing about the package already in place. And therefore, the Treasury could not have been unaware that whatever it proposed in the public interest economically going forward came with risks. I mean, there is no way which any responsible Treasury could consider implementing plans without having at least half an eye on the epidemiological consequences. Otherwise, she wouldn't have been writing to you in this term.
I said I didn't write this email.
And you didn't see it, you think?
I ever saw these emails. That's just not something that I would have done, right? I would have been briefed here and there on things that I needed to know, but I definitely didn't see these emails on a regular basis.
Questions like risk and whether or not Treasury plans would have an impact upon prevalence and an increase in transmission and ultimately hospitalisation and death were obviously issues which were brought to your attention.
Yes, and my strong recollection is that the set of measures that were announced in the May plan was one which the scientists had fedded on, had modelled, and was consistent with R being at or below 1. And on their advice, one step of that plan was delayed for, I think, a fortnight in June. And there were measures that were continued with after this email, which rather suggests that there wasn't a significant concern raised, because when they had raised a concern previous to this, the government acted on it with regard to delaying whichever step it was, step 2 or step 3. So I think there is a track record of the government responding to the concerns that the scientists had and actively delaying a stage of the unlocking.
All right.
So that's all I can remember about that event. Yeah.
That's clear. Can I squeeze in one further topic before the break, and it's this, and we can deal with it very shortly. Your statement refers to the issue of PPE. Prime Minister, that is, as you know, a matter for a later hearing, but you address the issue of PPE from a high-level Treasury perspective. Is this a fair summary of the position insofar as the Exchequer was concerned? Plainly, HMT involvement in the issue of PPE commenced right at the beginning. It commenced in March 2020. Is that right?
Yes, that is right.
All right. And although at the beginning the Treasury was obligated to approve individual PPE contracts at the request of the DHSC, the Treasury agreed to depart from the usual process and put into place a flexible spending control envelope. So the DHSC were given an envelope within which they could spend and within which they could enter into PPE contracts without having to go to the Treasury or the Chief Secretary to the Treasury or you. And that funding envelope started, I think, at £100 million on the 25th of March, but by the 11th of April, it was £1 billion. Is that a fair summary of the envelope position?
Yes, it's probably worth me expanding on it.
Well, only if you think that we'd be greatly assisted by it, given that there is another module looking at it, but it may or may not be the case. You'll have to give evidence in that module, and I'm trying to cover the possibility you might not, Mr. Sunak by asking you just to agree with my general proposition now.
I think that the first thing to say is I wasn't involved in it day to day because it was led by the Chief Secretary.
Yes.
Generally, we aim to move at pace given the urgency of the requirements. And as you suggested accurately, we put in place a new way of doing it so that rather than individual contracts being agreed, as would be normal with the scrutiny that would come from that, HMT gave to the Department of Health a budget that it could spend. It raised that budget, I think, 5 different times. It ended up being close to £14 billion in the end, so that there would be no blocks and there would be speed of approval so that PPE could get to the people who needed it. And the last thing to say was no issues were ever substantively raised with me about blocks in that process or delays at all, including, I think we had a meeting in April on the PPE plan, and there's no minutes or anything recorded of there being any issues about that. I think it worked very well from our ability to give the Department of Health the cover it needed and the funding it needed to buy the PPE that it wanted.
The approval process was amended at great speed, very rapidly.
Yes.
And lastly, the Treasury was properly concerned in the process as to what sort of checks and balances should be put into place, and that was something then that was negotiated between yourself and the DHSE. So you might suggest, well, these are the sorts of conditions which you need to apply when you enter into individual PP contracts. So you kept a controlling hand on the overarching system of checks and balances whilst not being concerned with the individual deals.
Yes, but those overarching conditions were deliberately flexible.
And they changed over time.
So that there could be no issue with Department of Health procuring the PPE that it wanted at the speed that it wanted. And as I said, led primarily by the CST, but there was a deliberate change to the normal processes to enable pace at the expense of the same normal amount of rigour and scrutiny that would go into those approvals.
Thank you.
Right. I've been asked to take a shorter lunch hour.
I'm very sorry.
Sorry, lunch break. So I shall return at 1:55.